Welcome to l'arte dell'Armi, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition. Today's guest is Puck Curtis. Today's guest is Puck Curtis. Puck, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
I am so happy to be here with you guys.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you here. The reason that we really wanted to bring you on and talk to you is because we're seeing in the historical narrative that we've been studying in this early 16th century Italian history, a lot of overlap between Spanish and Italian forces, and we wanted to learn a little bit more about Spanish fencing. And you're the expert, so we figured we'd have you on and let you enlighten us a little bit.
I should say I'm one of the experts. Outside of Spain, I do pretty good. But yeah, I'm happy to help with that. And
among English speakers, you're probably the expert.
I'm pretty good. I think I'm one of two people in English that's published. And I live with one of the other ones, so
inside track.
If you want to be get the inside track on Spanish historical research, my first piece of advice is to marry a Golden Age Spanish research PhD.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll try and put an ad out for an Italian equivalent for that. We'll see what I get.
Good luck.
They put that on your OkCupid profile.
Yeah, just keep swiping until you find that one.
Oh goodness. Yeah, so I guess this is it's really interesting. I'm going to jump ahead here because as this is a Bolognese podcast, I think my most interesting question, and sorry, Stephen, I'm going to...
Oh, you're killing me.
I know, but... All right, so from what we know about Manciolino, or from what you know about Manciolino, why do you think that he, of all the Bolognese authors, was able to capture the imagination of the Spanish court in Naples?
Probably a bad thing to ask me, because my Bolognese details are all about 10, 15 years old. I know that if we look at the first source text of the Destreza tradition, Caranzza is reactive to that tradition, so he's aware and responding. He's critical. So when we look at Destreza is a Reformation tradition, which is based on the fencing which exists around it. So he's probably in the same class of fencing authors that we would consider people like Agrippa and Vigiani. These people are reformers of this early Renaissance style, which shows up in from Fiore and Lichtenauer. We're moving away from that into something more structured.
Right. Kind of getting into modern fencing, essentially through rationality.
Maybe I'm gonna quibble a little bit with that. What I'll say is we're gonna move into a classical period. So. And I'm going to differentiate classical, which is very theory-based, with modern, which is more sporting.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think or perhaps maybe from your knowledge of just the history of Spain, I think what's really interesting about Manciolino in particular is that his patron was Don Luigi Fernandez de Cordoba, and he's the son-in-law of the great captain.
Yeah.
And it's just wild to me that of all the people, they, for some reason, he ends up kind of there in Naples and with this person that is incredibly famous. I think Don Luigi ended up going up to, or Don Luis, if we're using his Spanish name, but he's Luigi in Italy. But he ends up going up and he treats with Henry VIII. So he takes a trip up to the court of Henry VIII. He's there for a while, comes back down, ends up becoming the Viceroy of Naples, and then the ambassador to the Pope. And it's a pretty prestigious position. And obviously, with his father-in-law being who he was, it makes a lot of sense that he would have that kind of political weight. But for Manciolino, of all people, to just kind of find himself, sort of treating with this group, this sort of collective group, is super fascinating.
It is. So I think that probably if you look at the Spanish tradition, they're reacting against the Bolognese school, and they're more in line with the Florentine school. So I don't know. So research on the Florentine school, the school coming out of Florence, is really only dropping within the last, say, 5 or 10 years. I'm not sure if you're aware of some of that work, but it's really interesting.
We're pretty familiar with Docciolini.
There we go. That's our guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Altoni, I think, is still untranslated and is kind of a mystery to us.
It's been published in Italian.
It's in Italian.
It has, yeah. Yeah, I've worked through the Anonimo Ricardiano, which seems to be in this similar vein of Altoni and Docciolini. I can't say for certain, but it does seem like it fits within that style. So,
yeah, maybe. I mean, look, we're all talking to each other, and we sort of are kind of inside the loop on this. But maybe if we set this context for people listening, it might help. So
yeah,
great idea.
We've got these early Renaissance Italians like Fiore and Vadi, and then we have the Dardi school that comes in with the Bolognese tradition. And then on the other side, we've got people like Docciolini, who are working off Altoni's work. And Altoni, if we look at the common school of fencing in Spain, early fencing in Spain, it appears to be something like either Dardi school or it's like Altoni, and leaning one way or the other. And when Caranzza shows up, he takes stuff that is clearly from Altoni's, like he's taking German stuff, he's taking stuff that looks a lot like Altoni's stuff, and then he washes it all with Aristotle and tries to clean it up. Before Caranzza, the fencing masters of Spain, so many of them were illiterate that they would sign their names with an X.
Oh, wow.
Caranzza, he comes through and he reforms fencing for the upper classes. So it's no longer a trade, it's something that the nobility do. And then after that, the idea that a fencing master would not be able to sign their name is anathema. Because you need to know Aristotle and you need to have a Renaissance education to teach fencing at that point. So just to give you some ideas, like Altoni, he describes 3 guards, like high, middle, and low. And if you look at Caranzza, he describes 3 positions of the sword, and that's in high, middle, and low. He names them according to the angle of the arm, so he calls them obtuse, right angle, and acute. And a lot of these things that we see in Altoni show up in the Destreza tradition, but they're all tidied up and reframed through Aristotle. So after Altoni, we get Docciolini. Docciolini, I know that you can't see the image on the podcast, but Docciolini's got a circle with a triangle in it in his book. If you look at Caranzza's book, his circle has a circle with a triangle in it.
Right.
So it looks very compelling to us that there's a lot of connective tissue between these two traditions. And like a lot of traditions, we're evolving and we're adding and we're changing. So what is this magic thing that Caranzza does? And why is Caranzza trying to do this stuff? If you look in his book, Caranzza's big jam is the young men of Spain are wild and they're out of control and they're a menace to the society. Yeah. Thankfully, in our time, there are no young men who are wild and out of control. We've largely got that solved.
Yeah, we have.
So, I mean, we don't need to teach people fencing to make better individuals, except that we absolutely do. So, Caranzza just clearly states, look, this is all a gimmick, and what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying to educate young men so that they're better citizens. And I'm going to teach them a Renaissance education, and it's all just hand-waving for this one goal, and fencing is the wrapper, which is the bait.
That's just as a sideline, that could be just making explicit what is implicit in Manciolino. I know that you were talking about the connection between Manciolino and the Spanish court, and it could have been that particular connection of fencing as a form of erudition, as Manciolino presents it, rather than just dudes whacking each other with swords.
That's absolutely what Caranzza is about. Yeah.
So it could have been just making basically like you were saying, washing and making explicit what Manciolino was doing, which could have been solving the prime problem now, was this problem throughout Spain or was this in Castile?
So Caranzza perceived this as an issue in Spain.
Okay.
He's an interesting guy in a lot of different ways. But he was a captain in the cavalry during the War of Portuguese Succession.
Okay.
And just like, so the last remaining heir in Portugal dies, and Spain decides that they've got a claim to the throne, so they're going to move in.
Naturally.
And in the north of Spain, those battles were really brutal, and they would sack cities. And sacking a city is horrible. I mean, we see some of that today with Ukraine, right? But imagine that that's state sanctioned, and nobody has a problem with it.
Oh, yeah.
In the southern part of Spain, there's Caranzza, and there's this guy named the Duke of Medina Sidonia. And Caranzza serves in his household.
Okay.
And people trusted Caranzza's words so much in Spain that they would surrender cities to him.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
He was that well respected. There was just something about this guy. And I give a talk on Caranzza as a person, and I talk about like this word macho. It originally meant elite masculinity, and not in a negative way like it is today.
Right.
And Caranzza is this, like, he's a performance of elite masculinity in the Spanish age. He is like the Captain America of Spain. And there was
I love it.
There was something about this guy that people responded to, even when he was really young. His nobility, he was a lower ranking nobility called an hidalgo. Mm-hmm. And he was attached to the family of this other duke, and they would hold dinner for him because they wanted their kids to be around Caranzza, because there was just something
just a great
about
role
him.
model.
He was,
great.
yeah. He just had this mojo. So he serves the Duke of Medina Sidonia in the War of Portugal, the succession crisis. They take Portugal, and eventually he decides he's going to leave the service of the Duke. He writes his book, and he ends up in the Americas, in Honduras. So if you like to really get the Spanish going, tell them that Caranzza, the founder of the great Destreza tradition, died an American.
He was a Honduran.
Yeah, that's right. That's where he died, and he was buried in the Americas. So I think we can claim him.
Okay, sounds legit to me, man.
Cool.
I bet they'll love that.
Yeah, I keep trying that one out on them. I get mixed results. I get some faces.
Clearly, you haven't been killed for it yet, so that's a big improvement.
Not yet. I'm on really good terms with all that crowd. I love them to death, and they've been very, very generous. When I was there, I studied there with them briefly in 2008. My wife, Dr. Mary Curtis, was over there doing research for her Fulbright scholarship on the tradition. Mm-hmm. And when I trained with the Spanish fencers in the club, they just wanted us to share this tradition with everybody. They thought that the tradition was beautiful and that it was worthy of everybody trying this thing.
Kind of how we feel about the Bolognese.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely.
I derailed your question, didn't I?
I think
No,
we
no, no.
were just going. It
I
was
think
great.
that was, yeah,
Yeah.
that was wonderful. That was a lot of really awesome insight into, something that I don't know a lot about. So I learned a lot from that. That was really great. So let's talk about fencing. You're particularly known for your work with La Verdadera Destreza.
Sure.
Do you describe your fencing background, or could you describe your fencing background and what led you to your interest in LVD?
Yeah, so I started in the mid 90s in the SCA, and the fencing there, I love the SCA. It's free-form fencing, very little training. So as you get better by experience rather than by practice or training or expertise. You can find people there, or in the 90s you couldn't find people there who had good pedagogy. And so I got good enough to do well. And then in the mid 90s, I found this tradition, the Spanish tradition, and we started researching it. And the early work that we did was awful. I mean, it's always awful. And I, being like one of these first generation researchers, I think the strongest recommendation I can give to people is appreciate that you have a big community today, because I could be wrong for 10 years and not know it back then. Right? I remember.
Yeah.
I remember getting emails from Spain saying this is wrong, and I'm like, oh man, and that stuff is a gut punch. And
Yeah.
so you need to develop this ability to bounce off being wrong in a good
Right.
way.
Yeah.
And that's really important. Today we have a community, and so we're constantly being challenged and tested, and our ideas, like our bad ideas, are resolved much more quickly. But back then, you could hold on to a bad idea for a long time. So I had been fencing in the SCA. We found this new tradition, and then people like Bob Sharon and William Wilson and Jarek Swanger show up, and they start translating these books. And I started teaching Italian fencing from Capoferro based on the Swanger and Wilson translation, which was what everybody was doing in the 90s. And what I found was I was teaching these kids in the park in Tulsa. And like at that point, the homeschool families found out there was some random dude teaching fencing in the park, and so they all showed up with their kids. And started teaching these kids this Italian fencing from the 1600s. And what happened was they all got a lot better, a lot faster than I did. And
Right.
so instead of teaching like the SCA taught, I began to get a real strong faith in the idea of system teaching. Like if you teach from a system and that system is cohesive and coherent, people get better a lot faster. So my kids were getting good. I was getting good. The dot-com crash happens, and we end up in California. And at that point, I'm really a strong advocate for teaching from systems. And I happen to just land in the backyard of the San Jose Fencing Masters program. And that was founded by Maestro William Gogler. He studied under Noddy. And, their lineage goes back to the 1600s. So suddenly I've got access. I've got a rapier system, and I've gotten pretty good at it. Now what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to teach it better. So I go to this fencing pedagogy program, and I learn what it means to teach fencing. And as somebody who had done historical fencing, there's a lot of information there. The biggest thing that I got out of that was when we were reading Science of Fencing, which was Gogler's book, there was so much that we were getting from the tradition on the floor that wasn't in the book. And the delta, the difference between the knowledge present in that room and the little that we had in the book was enormous. So we think about all that, we call that floor knowledge. The floor knowledge that has been lost for these historical traditions, it's priceless. And we don't have that. We're rebuilding all of that floor knowledge, and we're building a whole new generation of teachers and instructors. And the knowledge that they learn is priceless. So, like you're probably teaching tradition now, right?
Oh yeah.
And we have to have a mechanism by which we transfer that detailed pedagogy onto the next generation. So I learned pedagogy. I took a lot of hits on my body teaching this tradition, And then I take all of that and I say, how can I apply this to these historical traditions? And what are the things that I need to ensure that these traditions survive? That's everything I get from the Sonoma program.
Wow. That's pretty moving, man. I think maybe one of the cool things about that is the science, or the, I guess, the process of making that floor knowledge is pretty fun and exciting.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I love that, even though, every right thing seems to be the result of doing every wrong thing once and learning until you finally arrive at the truth. That's, I think, one of the intoxicating things about the whole HEMA process.
Oh yeah, I've done things wrong in so many different ways. If I was fragile, or if I held on to my ideas and didn't let the bad ideas go, I would not be where I am today.
Well, that's one of the great things about being married. You learn to let go of your bad ideas pretty quickly.
That's right. Just apologize, move on.
Yeah, you save yourself a lot of time.
Buy a comfortable couch.
So, as you had that experience of going from a historical background into something that had that development of floor knowledge, and then going back into developing a system and sort of developing your own floor knowledge as you were exploring a system that was new to you, what were some of the things that you found were either missing, or that you were able to start to develop, or maybe perhaps better understood from when you were studying Italian fencing to when you started developing your knowledge and understanding of the Spanish system?
There's a lot of subtle things. So as part of my examination process, because I tested for instructor, provost, and master. As part of that, what I had to be able to do was I had to be able to visualize fencing with my hands behind my back and describe it. So I had to develop a common language of fencing that we would all share that was highly technical. So that includes things like timing and structure, and what are the phases of a fight, and how do you get somebody to reveal their tendencies, right? And then how do you coach those things? These are all really important. And if you go to a historical text and you bring those with you, they're really valuable. So any virtue is a two-sided coin. Every time you get a virtue and a weakness. Mm-hmm. Right. So I have this fencing knowledge, right, which is a virtue, but it also gives me a bias, right? I flip that coin over, I have virtue and bias. So I need to be mindful that I go into these old texts with a lot of information that can be really helpful, and then I also have to really closely examine my biases. But let me think if I can think of a specific one that is really helpful. Cueing. Let's say cueing.
Okay.
All right. So what is cueing and why is it important? I learned a lot of very specific cueing on the floor as a teacher. So in order to test for an instructor, we were doing 1,000 lunges a day on the student side. And so that meant when I was on the instructor side, I was receiving 1,000 touches a day. Once you've taught a tradition long enough that you've taken 10,000 hits on your body, that changes how you see the tradition. We talk about cueing, right? And so cueing is to show the student something which is accurate to their needs. So the strength and resistance in my arm might tell a student to glide along the blade, but when my arm relaxes, it tells them to release and cut. Mm-hmm. Right? And so there are all these subtle pieces of teaching that you do with your body and with your voice and with the way that you present yourself that really matter. All of that can translate over to historical work. Then I was taught how to structure lessons, how to control a room, how to manage safety. All of these things translate immediately. Some of the mechanics don't translate. Like I'm not going to use one-handed sword techniques with a great sword.
Right.
But
yeah,
still, like the flow of a fight, what is offensive, what is defensive, what's counter-offensive? Can I structure those things? That all translates.
yeah, that's awesome.
Wow. Okay, that's really cool. I feel like I'm getting smarter just listening to you.
Or you could be getting dumber. Like dumb people feel smart.
All right. Cool. All right. So cueing, that's really interesting. So cueing is basically, from an instructor's point of view, when you do a thing to elicit a certain response from your student to teach them the thing that you're trying to teach them.
Yeah. Gogler has this thing. He says the lesson should be the mirror of combat. And so when I think about cueing or what I show the student, we go through these stages, right?
Okay.
I'm going to teach technique first. And so technique is really structured, right? And new people need a lot of structure. They like rules.
Right.
And so you lay down all these rules. You have a lot of control over everything that they do. And you walk them through it. I want you to do this. I want you to do A. And then I want you to do B. And then I want you to do C. Listen to my voice. Look at my body. Go. A, B, C. As they get more comfortable, I start pulling out supports for them. So instead of telling them exactly what to do, they're going to get my hand held up, showing them the palm, and then I'm going to say go in Italian or Spanish, depending on which tradition I'm teaching. And then they're expected to do all those things. And then I'm going to continue raising the difficulty and shaving away layers of artificiality so that they're getting closer and closer to combat. I'm going to start tricking them and throwing in changes so that they're never quite predictive, rather they're responsive. All of these things translate. And so we get this idea of progression of difficulty in the pedagogy that we're showing them and the cueing.
Okay, right. So that makes sense. So structuring your curriculum essentially from the training wheels to fencing.
Yeah.
Kind of removing the supports along the way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, these days I'm more in demand for pedagogy training and how to certify instructors than I am for the tradition. I think the Spanish tradition is pretty safe.
Right.
But the place that I'm useful is a school wants to certify an instructor. Well, what does that look like? Or we need to put together an advanced pedagogy program. What does that look like? Well, I know that. I can help with that.
Cool. I wasn't aware that was even a thing right now. That's cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Do you want me to take a few now, Joshua?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So I crossed a few off. Let's move on to getting it towards the Italian here. So in your opinion, how did early LVD differ from contemporaneous forms of Italian fencing?
Oh, yeah. So you have to think about like Caranzza's role as a reformer. And like the easiest way to differentiate between Italian fencing and Spanish fencing for true school fencing, the fundamental principle of Italian fencing is to strike without being struck. Right. That's how it's defined in a lot of the rapier texts. The fundamental principle of Spanish fencing is to defend yourself and strike well defended. It's almost the same statement, but the focus is really different, right? So
Sounds like Manciolino.
yeah, well, the Spanish, that strike without being struck is really aggressive, and defend and strike while defended. It takes that whole thing and flips it. Like we're not here to kill ourselves. We're here to protect ourselves and then wound the adversary.
So it's more like control their weapon and let them run themselves upon it if they insist, as opposed to find the safe opening or find the opening and get it.
Yeah, I was raised in Oklahoma, so I sometimes like distill things down into Okie speak.
Okay, let's hear the Okie version of it.
Don't be stupid.
What is it?
Don't be stupid.
Don't be stupid. Got it.
I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, so, Manciolino, I find that interesting because Manciolino has a similar approach in that, and I see this throughout his pedagogy where, in the way that he sets up and structures his overall curriculum, where he gives a statement in his introduction, his general advice for fencing, where he says that every defense should be followed with an offense and every offense should be followed with a defense, and that you should always defend yourself going forward. As in, like, you're making this progressive approach into your opponent, but you're also doing so in a way where you're not overcommitting in your attacks by any means, and you see throughout his techniques and everything like that it is still very much a defensive style and system. Where even with his book on provocations, his book one, where he gives a series of provocations, it seems like a lot more of his creativity is actually baked into his defense, and his defense is very much, it's relatively simple in terms of transitioning between Cordia de Testa, Cordia de Faccia, and using a mezzo mandrito. Those are basically his three main defenses. But I think that's kind of interesting in that I don't know if I see that specifically with authors like Marazzo and the Anonimo as much. Maybe a little bit more with the Anonimo than Marazzo. But it does seem like there's that differentiation between Manciolino and the other Italian authors. And maybe that's kind of the crux in the split. And maybe that's why Manciolino was, favored by the Spanish. I don't know.
It certainly makes some sense. Like the Spanish way of entering into a sword fight, right? Like if we're out of distance, we have all the time in the world. We have an economy of movement. And as you get closer to the adversary, every movement costs more.
Right.
Right. Up to death. That's the final cost.
Right.
So when we're well outside of distance, movements are free.
Right.
And when we get into that distance, essentially like wide measure, right? Then we're going to show you the point, put it on your body, maybe try to talk you out of this fight. If I feel like I need to move closer, then I'm going to cover your sword with mine, and then I'm going to step into this middle space where we're much closer, but I have a really strong advantage. It's analogous to like in boxing to the pocket. Like if you can get control of the adversary's sword and step into the pocket, you become a powerhouse.
It's essentially stringere in the Bolognese tradition.
Yeah, exactly. It's like stringere but at misura stretta, right? So we take a step in, we're dominant, we're close.
Right.
And at that point, if I extend my point, I could strike you with a movement of the hand.
Right.
And then I can force action. So we don't really feint in the Spanish tradition. We're not supposed to act on information that we don't have. Mm-hmm. That being said, we're going to threaten you with the point.
Right.
And then when your arm moves, we're going to move too, right? So there's a big discussion about whether or not that's actually a feint. Sometimes what we'll say is we're going to do things that are vulgar. Vulgar is like bad fencing. Mm-hmm. But when we do them, we're going to do them by the truth. So when I step into this middle place, I've got your sword and I'm quite close, and I put my sword on your eye, I feel like I've got enough control that's pretty safe.
Got it.
That I can provoke you, and then when you defend, I'm going to change and attack a different target.
Sounds pretty similar to the Bolognese approach, as best I understand, for the sword alone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, because when you're fighting sword alone, that point commands your attention pretty well, unless somebody's really committed to wide play and can beat it aside well. It's that point is really the game.
It's really strange in the Spanish tradition. We are a motion palette system. So we're going to use the same motion for different things. So sometimes if you're making a big cut, we'll put the point on you in the preparation of the cut, and that's considered defensive because we're just there to disrupt.
Yeah.
If I'm in the middle in that pocket and I put the point on you, we call it something else. But really, both of those are trying to get you to move and to put you in obedience, as Fabris would call it.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds pretty similar too. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm just sitting here thinking about all of the Bolognese tactical ideas in my head and how they seem so analogous and just kind of like they're kind of feeding off one another, at least kind of touching on the same principles and ideas.
I've got some differences that might be interesting to you. Maybe okay. So let me lay out my understanding of Darty school timing, right? So the way that I understand it is it goes guard, movement, guard, right? And that's how we lock in our time. When we look at the Spanish timing, they're a vector-based system. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's based on the German tradition. So we have before, during, and after. Mm-hmm. And then we can take a fencing action. Like let's say that I'm going to beat the sword. Mm-hmm. on the inside line, and then I'm going to redirect with a thrust.
Right.
Now we're going to take that's like a Lego structure, right? We're going to decompose that into its components. So in order to beat the sword toward the inside line, my hand has to travel from my right to my left to impact the sword. Mm-hmm. Then it needs to return to center line. So traveling to the left, and then returning to center, and then moving forward. That's 3 Legos. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, every one of those has a before, during, and after, and every one of them could be countered inside each movement. Mm-hmm. So instead of the Italian system that you're used to seeing with the rapier, like single tempo, double tempo, half tempo, you're going to see that we'll take an action, we'll decompose it into movements. It could have 15 movements in it, and then we'll lay out a countering system for every single piece of that.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a little funky.
It sounds, so one of the challenges of Bolognese is to make it work, you have to assume that it works, and that there are things in there which are implicit, which are made explicit by better and later authors who have the advantage of having access to the Bolognese art to describe their art, right? So the Bolognese were essentially almost the first people to print fencing manuals, other than Pietro Monte's fun little book on how to fight with various weapons. It was not in any way systematic, and the Bolognese are the first to present a systematic approach to describing fencing, whereas the people who had access to those books could look at that and go, like I can explain this, I can explain that better. Kind of again how you're describing in early HEMA, you could have the wrong idea for 10 years because there wasn't existing data or people who had existing data to counteract what you were saying.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It makes absolute sense.
And so that's where, when we talk about Bolognese time, we don't know exactly what's implicit. So, and one of the things that they'll do, like in the Anonimo, is you might be going into a guard that's low and offline to the left, and there's 20 various responses in the book that you can make from there. And presumably it's kind of depends on where you are in the motion relative to your opponent is what's going to provide which of those is the optimal motion. It's just not nearly as well described as what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I think even within that, like the Spanish, they have a reputation for being really, really complex. Yeah. And that's fair. I mean, sometimes simple things are challenging to understand or to explain. But when you boil Spanish true school fencing down to its core, there are 2 things I need to know about the movement of my adversary's sword. And is it wounding me at this moment, right? Mm-hmm. We call those executive movements. So is the motion of the sword about to wound me? Or is it dispositive, which is prepping or some sort of random movement, maybe a twitch, anything that's not a wounder? If it's not a wounder, then I'm going to show you the right angle. I'm going to put the point on you and threaten you in some way. If it is a wounder, then I'm going to put my sword on top of your sword and cover it. And then I'm going to do something else.
That's very simple.
It's very simple. And if you're not moving, then I'm going to cover your sword with my sword and try to step into the pocket.
So you're either putting your sword on top of their sword, or you're extending your sword into guardia di faccia.
Yeah, or we would call it right angle, but yeah.
Sounds like
Manciolino. You want to load something? I'm going to put the point in your face. Now what are you going to do?
Right.
You're going to hit me? I'll put my sword on top of your sword. Did I get it? No. Well, let's find it again, and I'll put it on top.
Right.
Whatever I have to do.
Yeah, so to kind of roll back to your previous point, it is interesting because I think Manciolino and Marozzo both do discuss the idea of acting within the moment of your opponent's tempo and within the moment of their action. Like Manciolino specifically says that the correct tempo, especially, I think he says, I can't remember if this is when he's talking about fighting against another skilled fencer, but is to act in the time of their motion. So when they start a motion, if you can interrupt their motion or make a smaller movement within their motion, then that's the sauce. That's where you really want to be, right?
Chef's
and
kiss,
so yeah,
right?
yeah, chef's kiss for sure. And then Marozzo gives a much more kind of chaotic description of this later on in his longsword section, where he talks about the same thing, and he talks about the Bolognese concept of rising and falling, which is a defensive technique that is kind of illustrated a few times throughout Marazzo and Manciolino. And I don't know if it's in the Anonymous, Stephen. Do you know
What?
if he does he use rising and falling at all? No. Okay. But
He
Manciolino and
uses
Marazzo
rising
both
and
do.
falling, but yeah.
Yeah, but the concept is, and then Marazzo goes on this long diatribe, and he makes it really confusing because he's tying like two broad, big concepts together in this one crazy thing because he's Marazzo. But I find it interesting that there is still this notion of that being there, but I wonder if it's just not fully developed, or if it's not like explicitly stated enough where it becomes a little bit more obvious. Like with an author like Vigiani, we get a really great description where he brings in Aristotle and uses Aristotle to describe tempo and like what time should look like and all of that. I mean, I think from an Italian influenced writer later on, probably the best description that we get of creating smaller tempos within the context of a larger tempo really comes from the Anonimo Vienna. But
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Bolognese tradition we have mezzo tempo, which is attacking into preparation, contratempo, which is attacking into their attack, and then tempo, which is just defending when they attack. So it doesn't sound nearly as deep or complex as the LVD take on it.
Well, we've got like the Lego based movement system where every movement is a vector and we can decompose. But and our timing system, so we talk about end time actions, right? Our timing system is really German based. So we take before, during, and after. And we've got three things that we're looking at there. So you talk about like first intention, right? For us, that's proprio. Adversary has not moved, so I'm going to strike them. And then we have, let's skip to the third one. So that proprio is a before tempo. They're not moving, I strike. And then transferito, they're attempting to wound me. So transferito in the books is defined as the outcome that my adversary wished, I take for myself. So they wish to wound me, I will wound them. That covers both counterattacks and parry ripostes.
Okay.
And then we have this middle one in the during tempo, which this is the really sweet stuff. I heard a dog fight going on. So in the middle, we've got this during tempo, and the during tempo is called appropriado.
Okay.
And that is, if the adversary gives me a dispositive movement, I wound them. And I can force them to give me those dispositive movements.
What's an example of a dispositive movement?
A dispositive movement is any movement which isn't a wound.
Okay, so this is like trying to gain, or it's like a movement against your weapon rather than a weapon move against yourself?
Let's say that I cover the adversary's sword with mine. I step forward, so I've got dominant position, and then I threaten their face. That parry that they make is a dispositive movement because it's not going to wound me. So as soon as they start to parry, I change and attack a different spot. Or if we're at distance and they decide they're going to try to cover my sword with theirs, I can act in that tempo. Any movement which isn't a wound allows me to act in tempo.
Okay, got it. So that's basically putting them in the knock.
Yeah.
To get all German about it. All right, cool. Let's see here. So we have a bunch of questions, so we should probably get on these. Okay. So can you just briefly give a sense of how did LVD differ from previous forms of Iberian fencing?
It is a show me tradition. So before Caranzza shows up, a lot of fencing was assertive. So the author will tell you something, and you're expected to believe it, right? There, you need to trust. And Caranzza has no patience for that at all. He's the show me. So everything must be demonstrably true. And then he's going to give you the science that will allow you to prove it. So it can't be just true for me. You also have to be able to test this and show it. So he has examples in the book about how an extended arm has the greatest reach, and he shows all the different possibilities, and he can prove it. And then he says, if you try to act on information that you don't have, like you just throw an attack in false time, the adversary can attack you at the same time.
Right.
So don't act on information that you can't have, which is something that a lot of fencers do. A lot of bad fencers do.
It's all beginning fencers. Well, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to attack and see what happens.
Just going to throw an attack and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he really is about proof.
Got
He's
it.
going to make a strong argument. The Caranzza text is a meta text about what makes good fencing. And we don't really get the tradition notated and written down well until we get to Pacheco.
Oh, so that's kind of Pacheco's role, is he's sort of the person who describes how the philosophy turns into fencing.
He really does provide us a good handbook. I say handbook. He's writing like 1,000 pages at a shot.
Oh my.
I think of Pacheco as a great notator. So he really takes the Spanish tradition, notates it. He's a lot like a classical fencing author. He's really probably one of the great theorists of fencing in general. Probably the most prolific fencing author ever, because he's written thousands and thousands of pages on fencing. He takes this meta text on fencing, he takes the fencing of his age, and he creates this really coherent fencing system, which is in some ways a lot like classical fencing.
Okay.
And he presents it, and it really works. And after that, everybody is doing what Pacheco does, mostly.
So Carranza's ideas kind of are sort of out there, but they don't necessarily displace everything that's existent in Spain at the time.
Sort of. Caranzza was super popular, but his book was
Okay.
not a handbook. But there were people, if we get out to the San Luque de Barrameda, which is this town in southern Spain, and we get to Seville, you're going to see a lot of people that are Caranzza influenced. Like Thibaut was in that town, and he leaves, and he goes and creates this tradition of fencing, which looks a lot like us.
Right.
He's sort of the black sheep of the family, but he's different from Pacheco. So if you were in that area, probably you got a piece of that. And we know that Carranza's sons visited the Philippines, and there's some back and forth between the Eskrima traditions and the Spanish traditions. We know that there's a Caranzza school that flourished in the Americas. So when Caranzza leaves for the Americas, that's the point at which Pacheco suddenly is safe to make his move, right? He was derivative. And so he's like, oh, all hail the great Caranzza, read my book, read my republication of Caranzza stuff. Caranzza goes...
and he can't challenge him to a duel because he's too far away.
Not yet, right? It's like, as soon as Caranzza gets his butt on that boat and he sails away, Pacheco's like, all right, Caranzza is a liar. It's me. And so...
so he totally throws him under the bus, huh?
He does. And then, but the problem is Pacheco is like the patron saint of internet trolls. Back when the internet moved on paper, he would write these diatribes against. If you were a good fencing author, Pacheco probably wrote some mean things about you. So all the Facebook fights and everything like that, or Reddit, we can trace that all back. I mean, we're participating in a fine tradition of hating each other,
going way back.
Fencing. Yeah.
Ah, awesome. All right. So is there a kind of nature of Spanish or Iberian fencing? Is there particular commonalities? I haven't been exposed to a lot of it. One thing I've noticed is that Spanish fencing seems to be very guard light, whereas Italian fencing seems to be very guard heavy.
I think that's fair. The better we get at the footwork for Spanish fencing, the more it starts to look like. So let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
If we look at Italian fencing, the guard tends to sink a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to sink and we're going to lower our center of balance, and we're in this guard is a fortress, right? Fiore and the elephant. We can move. We're centered, and we have good connection to the ground.
Right.
If you look at Spanish fencing, we're much more upright. So instead of something like a low fighting style, we're a little bit more like boxing, and the fighting that we do tends to float and flow a little bit more like dancing. Mm-hmm. Like if you were to look at capoeira footwork and the way that they flow, that seems to be more in line with what we do. And the better we get at this is where, like, I talked about my own biases. Like, my bias is classical Italian and Renaissance fencing footwork. So I had to push that away and move into a more flowing footwork. And it's a continuous struggle for me personally to keep those two things separate. My students who study Spanish fencing, their footwork is way better than mine.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, so like being a Gen 1 researcher and fencer, sometimes it kind of sucks because like you train somebody and they're better than you, and you're like, I hate you. And then they train somebody else, and the Gen 3 fencer is better than both of you.
Ooh.
The hate just rolls downhill.
Oh my god. Yeah, I guess there's sort of an advantage to that. If you don't have any martial arts experience, it's pretty easy to learn to move at an angle. Certainly, if you don't have any fencing experience, it would never occur to you to move in a straight line. I mean, after day one of lessons where somebody says, yeah, if you go here, you're safe, but if you're trying to like get down that line fast after your retreating foe, like you're gonna just kind of have that built into your motors, into your muscle memory.
Yeah, and just to kind of build on what you said, like that low stance, because it's so stable. Like the first thing that we do with students that walk in the door is we line them up, we stand them up, and then we do opposition footwork. So one person stands at the front of the room, and that person walks back and forth with an upright posture, and then they try to do quick changes of direction, and the whole class has to follow that.
Right.
And then so we're moving back and forth, everybody's upright, and we're doing these quick changes, because I want you to get exposure to those quick changes with an upright body, and then we do it again in a circle. Because those lateral changes are way harder, and if you're not used to how to break and redirect your
feet,
your feet.
The momentum, yeah.
Yeah, basically a human body is a weight on a stick.
Right.
And when you stand that up, you topple really easily. So we need to learn how to handle that toppling effect by practicing a lot.
I think a lot of it, is like redirecting where you're toppling into the direction that you want to go. So you lose balance and you topple off to the left or you topple off to the right. And you just kind of follow along that.
Yeah, well, if you think about the way that a motorcyclist will lean into the turn, we get our quick change of direction by leaning into the direction where we want to go.
All right. Did you have anything to add there, Joshua?
So we're kind of discussing body mechanics. As with that upright stance and sort of the more upright posture and sort of casual, light on your feet, flowing style, how do you engage the rest of the body? How are the hips involved in the engagement with the shoulders and everything like that in terms of the overall dynamic?
That is a really great question. One of the sad things about modern people is that we have lost a lot of our physical culture. And so people walk into that space and they are not used to coordinating all those things. And what we have found, and I don't know if this is true for you, but it's certainly true for the older styles, is fine correction is really tough for people. And so when we want to teach body mechanics, we go to gross action.
Yeah.
So what we have found is we get a lot of value out of teaching people greatsword. And because the greatsword is so big, and it can be easier for us to teach the mechanics. So we teach things like when you step and when you're delivering force, are you aligning your hips in the direction of the force? Right? When you're chambering up a defense with the greatsword, are you presenting your true edge? What's the slope of the weapon? All of these things we can teach with these big weapons, and they're a little bit easier because the actions are bigger. And then we set that down and we go back to the sword in one hand. Everything gets smaller and finer, but they've had that exposure already. So I think there's something to that. We teach big and then we learn to go fine. And then we're going to get you with the reps. So like the footwork that we were talking about, you're going to do it a lot. And we don't want you to do it necessarily exactly like I do it, because I need to do it for my body. I want you to learn to do it for your own body within certain restrictions. Caranzza said that he hated to see tall fencers fence like short teachers. And I've seen that happen. I've seen short fencers fence like tall fencers because they had tall teachers. And what he said about students was that every student is a musical instrument, and you need to tighten some strings and loosen others until the instrument is in tune with itself.
Interesting.
And only then will it make.
That's beautiful.
That is really good.
He's this master of metaphor.
That's awesome.
Nice. All right. So since we're a Bolognese podcast, we're particularly interested in fencing intersections with Spanish fencing. So again, I don't know much about Spanish fencing, but I've learned a little bit here or there. So there's 3 moves that are basic motions which seem to have analogs between them. And the first is this basic idea of atajo. Can you tell us a bit about atajo? Is it just a fancy way of saying put your true edge over the scary thing?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I'm going to make you an honorary Okie for that phrasing. Because that's like, there are a couple ways I say this. I say like, okay, if something scares you, point at it.
Right.
And turn your knuckle bow towards the bad guy's sword.
Yeah. Okay.
Both of those. But there's a lot going on. When Pacheco defines it, he has a really formal definition. He says that atajo is subjection from above. It should have equal or greater degrees of strength. It should close the line so that the adversary can't hit you with a single movement. And then it should not participate in extremes. And that extremes is a callback to Aristotle's virtues, which are between 2 extremes.
Okay. Go
What
ahead.
he means is that you don't want to make a bind in the weak, and you don't want to make a bind in the strong. You want to bind in the middle.
So German Fuhlen.
Yeah.
So it sounds like get mechanical advantage and get advantage of the guard.
I think so. If we look at the Spanish fight in phases, like we have sort of distance phases. So when we're out at lunging distance, we're going to show you the point. And then the next thing that we need to do, somebody's going to get close, and that person will be either attacking in false time, in which case I'll cover their sword, and now I'm in the pocket because they closed, or I'll try to take their sword with mine, and I'll step into the pocket. That's what atajo is. It's either we're going to step in and take, and it sort of takes an offensive kind of formation, or we're going to defend with defensive steel, just like a parry. But instead of lateral motion, we're downward like a plow, like flug, right? So we're not pushing to the side. We're dropping our hilt and presenting a plowing surface so that they'll slide into our strong.
So it's interesting. I wonder why the general Italian... So the Spanish preference is for the sword straight ahead, and the Italian preference does seem to be for the sword low, pointing up. So like a porta di ferro stretta type of position. That seems to be just kind of the generally preferred thing, and I wonder why that is. I don't know.
It's a good question. I have some interesting stories about porta di ferro stretta. So in Pacheco's first book, he says, the adversary coming on guard to you with porta di ferro stretta. I call this Pacheco's yeehaw attack. What he says is basically the adversary's presented their weak in the high line, but my arm is already extended in the high line. Why shouldn't I just hit him? Right? So he's just going to try to blast through the weak at that point. I think that's young Pacheco when he still had the warranty on his knees. And if as an Italian fencing master, I would say that if you have the hand low and with the hilt and the tip high, then you provide coverage over the line. You get a good closure just by moving your hand. So, unfortunately, I'm on both sides of that fight.
Oh. Okay. So another one that I'm aware of is, and this is something that appears repeatedly in the Anonimo Bolognese, seems to be, I believe you guys call it a movement of conclusion.
Yeah,
is that correct?
With the hilts. Yeah.
Yeah, and so can you explain a little bit more about this?
This is really great because we set this up really well. So if we're out at, I talked about how the fight has distances, and that first distance is outside at lunging distance. We're going to show them the point. We call that right angle. Then the next distance is that middle place with the atajo where we're trying to get control of the weapon. And if, for whatever reason, the fight gets closer than that, we're going into grappling space. Right, so we've got those 3 phases. We've got out, middle, and very close. When we get to very close, either we're the way that our school breaks it down, this is a more modern way of breaking it down. We're either strong in the bind or weak in the bind.
Yeah.
If we're weak in the bind, we're going to yield through and lift our hand to close that threat and then seize their hand or hilt. If we're strong in the bind, then we just cover and step in and take their hilt. the thing about the Spanish that makes that really valuable is that they're not necessarily interested in lethal termination of a fight. So if a drunk 16-year-old shows up and tries to throw down with you in your fencing school, you have options, and you can seize their sword, take it away, and then walk them over to their father and talk to them about fencing lessons.
Cool. In the Anonymous, it appears that it's when you've gained on the inside, or you have advantage on the inside, and you begin your thrust. So they would then take their point off to their left in order to cover that thrust. You would come in with a reverse cut, a descending reverse cut that would require them to come up to cover that, and you would then be able to grab the outside of their sword or the outside of their wrist. So you kind of end up making that cut, and you come in with your hands at the same time. Mm-hmm. That sounds pretty similar to what you're talking about.
It could be. I think there's a piece of Spanish fencing called the movement of diversion.
Okay.
And if somebody covers my sword with theirs, have you ever seen Italian saber hanging parries?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a hanging 7 and a hanging first.
Right. Front hanging parry and back hanging parry, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Like St. George.
Yeah, if you push my sword on the inside line, then I'm going to lift my hilt up to cover my right cheek and show you my true edge. And it'll be like I'm showing you my wristwatch. And then with that, I can step around that cover and seize the back of your hilt, and then I'll load a big cut, and I can cut you in the back of the head.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. That's actually exactly how I see Marazzo's first defense against the thrust.
Same here.
Is basically going with that same wrenching action where you're going to the outside, pulling, and then it sets up that reversal.
It's
really
a total
nicely
bread and butter move. Like
it is, yeah.
I taught this to Maestro Murakoshi before he was a fencing master. And so what he found was he went down and fenced with the FCA, and it was people who'd been training Italian rapier. So they were better than average. And then he would show them the right angle and say, go ahead, take my sword. Give me that syringe. I'm showing you what you want. And then they would blast him with this huge lunge, and he would just fold out behind it and flow past it and wreck him. That's one of the things. If you're an Italian fencer and you're going to face a Spanish fencer, be aware that if you put pressure into that sword, you're going to get it right back. Because we're like, if you've seen the picture in Agrippa of him attacking the round stone, right? So, and the idea of that picture, he's attacking around a ball. You strike the ball will roll away from the strike.
Right.
That's our footwork. Is we get pressure, we're going to roll away from the force, and we're going to fold up on you like a soft taco.
Nice. That also seems to have analogs in the Anonymous where I believe it is actually the same idea when you get certainly on the outside, if you lose the line on the outside, then you would yield into basically a saber parry of 1.
Yeah.
Do that same kind of cut, but it's done on a retreat rather than on an advance.
Yeah, and we do the same thing. That's the other diversion where you're basically looking at your wristwatch instead of showing it.
Right.
Doesn't he give that a name, Stephen? That technique?
I don't think so. But it's really early in the... maybe he did in the introduction.
Yeah.
I think it's important to understand that Italian fencing wasn't always this linear, right? That's an important thing that the Bolognese
for sure.
Scholars bring back, is that there was a whole tradition that was circular with the footwork.
I'm pretty confident once we got rid of fencing equipment, and especially if we started using sharp swords, we would find that fencing footwork would naturally become a whole lot more circular. I think people are naturally, once they see, because, the point of a sharp sword, is a pretty terrifying thing. At least I found it to be so. And if I had to move anywhere near it, it's always going to be to the side, unless it tries to beat me, and then I'm going back to the other side. I'm always staying moving away from that bad boy.
Like Capaferro, who's one of the more linear people you're going to meet, he says, against people who circle, and he's got this argument where he rails against it. Look, those people, they gain my sword really well, way better than they should, and I hate it. What are you trying to tell me here, Capaferro? Baby, you're telling me that it works really well.
Oh my gosh. gosh. All right. So then there's this. We kind of alluded to this earlier. The third one seems to be this idea of moving forward at an angle. Usually, I like to describe it as into the bind. So if you are crossed on the inside, you'd be moving a little bit towards your left, or if it was on the outside, you'd be moving a little bit in towards your right to kind of basically to gain the advantage of the guard with that lateral motion. I correct me if I'm wrong, but that is also this how the Spanish would approach a Spada solo fight.
I think so. So we probably qualify that. The problem with Destreza is where everything depends on the context. So we're sort of a science engine. Mm-hmm. And we load in a situation and we crank it through the science engine, and then we're supposed to get a unique result out. So giving a really a generic answer, my students hate me because I always say it depends on the context. It depends on how tall you are, whether it's raining, is it a Thursday. But generally speaking, if I wanna retain the bind, then I'm gonna step into it. And if I feel that arm relax in the bind, like they're unloading, then I'm going to step away and throw a cut. So it's about, you ever see that movie where like Indiana Jones maybe is running on the top of a train and the bridge is out?
Yeah.
Right, and you know that you got to jump at some point, right?
Right.
But when you feel that train start to go out from underneath you, that's when
you jump. You're holding on to the last minute.
Right. When you feel a sword with your sword and you feel like a firm foundation, that's when you glide. Right, you thrust in opposition, and so you can step into that bind. But when you feel it start to drop out from underneath you, that's when you change and you step the other direction. You throw that cut because they're loading. They're going to come off and try and cut you on the other side.
Right. So that's okay. That makes sense. They're going for that double, and you got to beat them to it.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. I've been kind of hogging the questions here for a while. Joshua, do you want to take some?
Yeah. So in the Bolognese system, talking about kind of that idea of defense, and maybe this can feed in a little bit to an earlier question that I was trying to ask until my dogs freaked out up there. But the Bolognese seem to use the false edge or half turn of the hand and the body to control the enemy to the outside. Does LVD treat the outside differently than the inside? What about earlier forms of Iberian fencing?
Yeah, so the earlier forms, like common school, we have pretty good evidence that they're going to turn the hand. They're going to usually turn the edge in for that. And for us, I talked about how a virtue exists between two extremes. Mm-hmm. And what we would prefer to do is we're going to extend our hand with the true edge down as if we're shaking hands. Mm-hmm. And that edge down, true edge down, that's our strong edge. We want to keep that kind of in the middle, so that we can present it to either side quickly. Mm-hmm. And instead of turning the hand all the way, what we're going to do is we're going to carry the tip up and kind of give it a half turn. So we're creating that inclined plane that's going to slide force down to our strong, and we're pointing towards that threat. And if you change, I've only changed a little bit, and so I can change back. We're not real big on the back edge. We're more true edge people. And that's the truth, and anybody that doesn't do that will probably burn in Destreza hell forever.
Do you all get together and find the person who dared to use their false edge and stone them?
That's a pretty
the Great Destreza Council.
It's a pretty common joke. Well, the running joke is, okay, if you're going to go to Destreza heaven, you just need to figure out who's manning the gate and then give them the answers that they want.
Well, now that we know that Marazzo was a heretic, this is actually lining up pretty well, because it sounds like Caranzza was, probably the most saintly person that there was. So
I have to tell you what Pacheco said about people like Marazzo. He named him specifically. He said that their writings wander through the earth like this vast, horrendous monster, a tournament of their vanities. I told you he was the patron saint of internet trolls. He's ready to say mean stuff about everybody.
I don't disagree with that. It's actually really interesting. I mean, I've kind of lately, kind of going back to that concept of vectors, though, in terms of vectors for specific areas of defense and kind of progression of parries for different areas of attack and things like that. one of the things that I've noticed, especially with Manciolino, is like kind of going back to that whole idea of like guardia di faccia. You've got your point going forward, right? So you can meet, you could potentially meet somebody giving you a mandrito or a cut from the right with either going into guardia di faccia, which would end up being contratempo, or you could meet them with a mezzomandrito that would just kind of cover the line, or you can come behind it with that guardia di testa, right? And you can kind of set it off. But one of the things that I found is between those three specific actions, those are basically all of Manciolino's parries. Like everything that he does really frames around those three specific parries. So you have this really tight, almost triangle of defense where you can cover like all these specific lines in it. How do you think that like differs or is relative or similar to that kind of idea of vectors?
So I'm going to step away from vectors on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we would think about that kind of defense, right? So we got an inside and outside, and you're talking also about overloading. That's sort of a programming term, but borrowing an attack as a defense. And when I said that Destreza is a palette system, I talked about like putting the point on somebody that's defensive or offensive. It might be a provocation, but it's usually the same action. If we look at the parries, I can also parry with cuts, right? So my full circular cut could be a full circular cut that lands on your sword. My half cut could be a cut just in the same, a parry in the same way that you're using it. If we think about that, then the Spanish word for the full circular cut is tajo. The Spanish word for the half cut is medio tajo or half cut. And then there's atajo, which is an interrupting, right? Which kind of exists on that continuum, maybe, as the smallest form of these three. And it's just a cut that interrupts the weapon. If we look at the way that we're interested in defending, what we're going to do is we're going to put that point forward and keep it proximate to the adversary's sword hand. Because if we're close to that hilt, then we are close to wherever that threat's going to originate. And we can just float there. So if they load a cut on this side, then we'll turn our hand into that and point towards it. And if it's a feint, because we're proximate to their hand, it's very easy for us. They're going to be a lot longer in their tempo than we are. So we'll just pivot. They can float back and forth as many times as they want, but we're going to oppose big action with small action. And we'll get that advantage by putting the point out there and staying close to their sword hand.
That's actually really interesting because, we see that a lot with, Bolognese defenses in general, where they talk about going to the sword hand. And I wonder if that's almost a kind of like a missing nomenclature from just a dynamic sense of just that's how you should be making a good parry. And it just kind of comes across as like you're making this parry towards the sword hand or a mezzomandrito towards the sword hand rather than just kind of like the directionality of the sword hand to make that parry.
Yeah, if you just keep your point close to the adversary's sword hand, you're probably going to be pretty loaded for any kind of setup they're going to give you.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to eat it on their hand, they're probably going to have to redirect whatever they were doing into you and create that bind again all over. Or they're going to eat it on the hand, which is pretty much game over for a sword fight.
Yeah, I'd hope so. I can never quite tell. I had a friend who was unloading the dishwasher and got a knife through her arm because she had stuck her knives in upside down. So she comes out with this knife sticking out of her arm, and like everybody goes ooh ah, and then we like put bandages on her, and then so we sit down, and she's sort of sitting there thinking, I'm like, do you think you could have kept sword fighting? And she's like, what? And then she says, yes, I do.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. All right, so that maybe the shot to the hand isn't the one then.
It just depends. I've talked to other people. So like meat, you're probably not going to notice, but bone hurts like hell. So I had somebody who took a sword, let's not mention any names, but took a sword through the leg, and when it hit the bone, every other rational thought dropped out of their mind except please don't let them pull that sword out of my leg.
Oh, wow. I remember when I was starting out, I was fencing with this guy with light protection, and he hit the nerves on the outside of my forearms, and I couldn't actually hold a sword or a buckler after he hit each one. It like paralyzed the nerves out on the outside for a couple minutes. So That could also be maybe where those shots of the arm are coming from. They're also fight enders if you cut that nerve.
That's just it. There's so many variables we never know. So I always fuss at my students, like, once you hit somebody, you need to exit in good order. And if they don't, then I don't even care if I'm dead, right? Who cares? I'm taking you with me, chump.
That's why the Bolognese have that rule that you have the time of half a step, to hit, and it's still a legitimate hit. Like, that's how they weigh that out. Like, there's never anything where you just assume that they're dead.
Tebow's got this thing. He's one of our black sheep Destreza guys, but he's going to hit you so hard that he drives his sword all the way through to the hilt and knocks you down with the hilt. By driving it. That's just like, that's my safety net, is that I'm going to hit you so hard that I'll go all the way through you, and then I'll drop you to the ground with my hilt.
With the hilt.
Then maybe I'll be all right.
He sounds memeable for sure.
Yeah. Somebody wants to turn it up to 11.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you were talking about the progression to conclusion before.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder too if, when you are striking, obviously you're going to create an opening where you can get in on either the outside or the inside of somebody. And I feel like you can still continue to pursue that moment of conclusion. I actually find, at least from my fencing practice, that it's usually safer to continue forward rather than just kind of giving an open cut that makes you have to make that panic response where you're pulling out and having to cover yourself as you're fleeing. I know that it exists for sure. Throughout the Bolognese system, we have a lot of traversato cuts and things like that. But at least from my experience, it's been that, the safest thing, unless my opponent is denying me close play in some way, and they're trying to fight at wide play, maybe then I might have to make some sort of a covering blow. But if they give me the opportunity to continue to pursue and go to conclusion, then that's usually where I found that I'm safest.
It depends for me. I have a mixed relationship with conclusions because I really like them a lot. Mm-hmm. And as a short guy, I'm sort of like feisty, and I need to get into people's space. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the problem with conclusions for me is that I want to get in there and do them. So I have to remind myself that I need to be responsive. Right? Rather than plan a conclusion, I need to find them. Mm-hmm. If I try to plan, I'm going to get blasted in the face for sure because I'm thinking too far ahead. But if I can read the pressure in the sword and be responsive to it, that's when I get the good ones. If I need to throw and get out, there are two ways I move in for entering, for me personally. I'm going to control metal, or I'm going to control tempo. And if I show you a threat and you go to parry, then I've got control of the tempo, and then I can step in. And I don't have your sword at that point, so I need to do something. I'm going to wound you if I can, and then I'm going to get out. So I'll throw a cut through a defensive posture that will protect me in the line where your sword is, and then I'll use that to exit, and I'll be back in right angle when I finish the cut. Does that make any sense?
Totally.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
If you're a Bolognese, it's exactly how you'd approach fighting with a sword and buckler or sword and targa.
Yeah.
They're always now we stick them out.
I'm afraid we're probably pretty close family relatives that just hate each other.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, really, Spanish fencing is just a derivation of the stuff that's in the Anonima Bolognese explained well.
Oh, goodness.
Well, I was going to say that Manciolino was actually the father of Destreza, and that we're just starting to touch on the surface of that here in this podcast.
They can't be because he uses all false edge, man.
Oh, right, yeah.
I sort of think that we're doing sword fighting, and you guys are just doing it wrong.
Love that. So let's move beyond the unaccompanied sword. In this season of L'Arte dell'Arme, we're particularly focused on fencing in a military context. The Spanish were known for their sword and rotella men, the rodoleros. Can you tell us anything about the Spanish use of the rotella and other accompaniments?
Well, when it comes to the Spanish bucklers, we don't have a lot inside the true school tradition. Probably the person that would be best to talk to about that would be Tim Rivera, because he translated Godinho, and Godinho has a good section on that. I'm not this. I'm just not going to be as good as he is at it. The places where I intersect that, we talk about getting around the buckler, or we talk about or buckler and montante. And usually what that is we're going to throw a threat, get that buckler high or low, and then we're just going to strike where that we're going to get him into obedience. Get him to move their buckler and go where the buckler isn't. I'm afraid that even though Caranzza and Pacheco were both military, the Destreza tradition is largely civilian dueling sword.
Okay.
And they tend to believe that sword in one hand is like the queen, the best example of skill. We get a couple of people, so we do great sword as well, which is definitely a battlefield or bodyguard's weapon. And then we also do Iberian flail, and we do sword and dagger from Figueiredo and Tejado.
Okay.
Interesting.
All right. So it's a different kind of approach to the unaccompanied arms than we would be having. All right, cool. So the LVD then really just is focused on the sword alone as the like dueling sword.
Through the Pacheco line, yeah, but the swords changed. So when we're in the mid 1600s, you're looking at what we moderns would call a side sword, and then we start to get longer weapons and add cup hilts in like the 1640s. By the time we get to 1705, those weapons are so light and fast at that point that the tradition starts to radically change in some key ways. Still very much recognizable. And then we're all the way through into the small sword and saber era.
Okay.
It gets a little funky when you get into those areas, and there's a lot of French influence, but still recognizably part of the family.
Interesting. So there's a through line that goes all the way through the 1800s then for Spanish fencing?
And sadly it died. So there were some big wars, right? And
yeah, they had that big old buzzkill in the 30s, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I have a historical saber that I got off eBay for less than the price of one of our dueling swords, really, like the modern ones we buy. And it's so good. It's so well made that it has no blunt. It goes down to that butter knife thin tip. And when you press that tip against the ground, you get this perfect bend in the last third of the blade. All the people that knew how to make that weapon, all the people that used it, they're all gone. And we lost them all in these great wars. It's this tragic loss. We still can't really create the quality that they had then.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of floor knowledge for fencing.
It is,
Yeah.
So I guess there's probably nothing on pole arms then.
It depends. I mean, Thibaut's got some, and he's got some stuff against guns, but I'm not really a Thibaut guy.
Got it.
Oh, I take that back. I'm sorry. Figueiredo has, so Figueiredo's greatsword is part of our tradition.
Okay.
And what Figueiredo teaches the greatsword people to do, that greatsword's called the montante. He'll run pikes with it. So I have sequences. The greatsword rules work like katas, and some of them are in opposition to other weapons. So we've got a few rules against pikemen that we use. One of them is it's a 3 attack combo, and it gets the pike moving back and forth so that you can run up the pike and whack the guy on the other end of it.
Nice.
And then the other one is basically cover the adversary's pike with your sword and then do a flying, spinning jump and strike him. That one, it's super sweet. I'm old. I can still mostly do it, but at some point I'm gonna have to hand the spinning jump montante hit off to somebody younger.
Oh, that's awesome.
So the early Spanish, and this might be more of a historical question, but the early Spanish managed to raise a fair bit of hell with regiments called tercios, with a mix of pikemen and rodoleros and gunners. Do you have any opinion as to what made them so effective?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you already talked about the great captain, right? Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba.
Yeah.
That guy, like, he got beaten in one of the early campaigns that he had, his troops were not well trained. And he takes them back to Spain. He reorganizes based on these guns. So he's got swords and shields, pikes and guns. And he puts them all into this one unit with the guns on the sides, and they're under the shelter of these pikes. So anybody that wants to get to the guns has to go through the pikes. Anybody that wants to get to the pikes gets like flanking gunfire.
Yeah.
It was a revolution in armed combat. And they call him the father of modern military warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you already know all this because you mentioned him earlier. But yeah, he's legit good.
He is, and I mean, he basically, heralds the end of what we see as the sort of the height of the gendarmerie, like the great French cavalry that's sort of terrorizing Italy, because he gives a framework for how to defeat it, which is, setting up a fixed position, having the pikes and the sort of the combined arms and everything like that. And it isn't until 1512 that we really see a counter response, which is almost 2 decades later, in a period of constant warfare, which is actually pretty significant if you think about it. I mean, that's a pretty long time when it comes to constant warfare and somebody finally figuring out how to change it. And the big get is at the Battle of Ravenna, when Alfonso d'Este basically sets up his cannon enfilade and starts firing into their fixed position, and then it's kind of game over from there. But,
yeah, pike hedge isn't going to solve that problem.
Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting because, I mean, it's almost like an early take on trench warfare, and responding to a mobile, heavy sort of, I guess, dominating force that can move, but is also relatively short-ranged in a way, and having to deal with that. And trench warfare is relatively similar in that that's kind of what the machine gun was in terms of like later battlefields. And what it brought is it doesn't necessarily have a tremendous amount of range, but you're still talking about something that is relatively mobile, and can provide a lot of firepower down, and then you just have to respond to it by basically entrenching yourself.
And I think the lesson that we get from him, like, there's always going to, if you get a new and disruptive technology, figuring out the best way to use it, that's like somebody's going to figure that out. Somebody who's creative and smart. And then he unifies that with discipline and training. If we look at the way that I hate to be topical and I don't want to be political, but if we look at the way that the war in Ukraine is playing out, the Ukrainians coordinated with American military commanders for their training system. And they developed a disciplined and trained fighting force. While as best we understand it, the Russian military sort of slowly collapsed under the weight of corruption. And the difference in outcomes between those two military forces is really just stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things
that's actually.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I actually think that's why it's really interesting that Manciolino ends up down there. Is that from that context of, because one of the big innovations that Cordoba ended up sort of instilling within the Spanish forces and some of his military revolution was also, how do you counter the pikes? So if you have a pike formation that has, these gunners and you have your light cavalry that can kind of ride around, throwing javelins and things, how do you deal with other pike formations? That was kind of the big question mark, was how do you deal with the Swiss? And so his answer to that was to incorporate the sword and rotella men or the sword and buckler men into his formations. And then, at sort of the tail end of that development, we see them pulling in intellectuals, if we can consider Manciolino an intellectual at the time, or somebody who would have been considered an intellectual, somebody, you're pulling in outside sources to say, hey, what do you have to contribute to this idea that we're developing? Because, I mean, obviously, again, we just talked about how this war particularly wasn't over. at this point. I mean, it was still ongoing, and the Spanish were still very much engaged with the French. So they were still, and in the Swiss, to be specific, because the Swiss were constantly being involved. But and then as you have that transition towards, I guess the League of Cambrai period, you start to fight against the Germans as well, and the Landsknechts, and you see this continuation of a need to develop that counter opportunity, that something that can actually get in within those pike formations and take them out. And that was kind of the big experiment, was either, we see this a lot with either great swords, or we see it with sword and buckler.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to bust them up.
Yeah. That's that putting in a mix of sword and rotella guy in the middle of the formation, so that once they got into the push of pike, they just come through, was pretty brilliant.
I have another interesting pike story, so I told you that Caranzza had gone to the New World, and the settlement that he was running was plagued with pirates. And because of the nature of this guy, when he got to the New World, he immediately got in a conflict with the rich and the church, and he was excommunicated because of his ethics.
Okay.
Because of his ethics.
He had too many ethics, or not enough?
He was too ethical. So he said things like, okay, we need to create social programs so the poor have enough to eat. And if you're going to make natives work, then I want a notarized contract.
Got it.
I guess they weren't Franciscans.
Yeah, at the time, that's really notable. I mean, he's still a colonizing force, but he's really pretty moral. So at the point where the pirates are coming into the town, all the rich, they just flee immediately. And the people that are left are the poor, people who are racially mixed. These are the people that Caranzza pulled together for the last great battle of his life. And what he had some guns, he had some people, and some cattle prods, which he repurposed as pikes. They're just long sticks.
Nice, yeah.
Right?
Same basic thing. Big pokey thing. Yeah.
Right. And so they sharpened those up, and then they lured the pirates into the town square, and then they closed in on them from all sides with these pikes and guns and just destroyed them. He wiped them out.
Ooh, I see a side episode here one day.
Oh, yeah. Well, Caranzza's life is amazing, and I loved the idea that he was...
Sounds like a movie.
It does.
He needs a movie. He was so morally good that in the last great battle of his life, he was side to side with the poor and the people who were most beat up by the society. That was his great battle.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's beautiful. All right, so in 1509, there was a scrum over loot between some Bolognese troops and some Spaniards in a fortress known as Brissagallia, near Bologna. The Spanish seem to have gotten their butts kicked. Would they have lost similarly if they were using LVD?
Let's put that differently. If Caranzza was there, I feel like it would have gone differently. Let's say this. You got a bunch of mooks on one side and a bunch of Spanish on the other, and if Captain America shows up... You put your money on the side with Captain America.
Awesome.
I'm just saying, if Caranzza was there, there's a decent chance it would have swung the other way.
All right. Well, sadly, we'll never know. I think he was not yet even a drop of wine in his mama's glass yet.
Yeah, it was just a happy thought.
I mean, the way that you talk about Caranzza, I'm deeply interested in this now.
Yeah.
I think I need to get a copy of this book.
Okay, I'll tell you one more Caranzza story.
Okay, yeah.
So Caranzza is he's gotten to the New World and he's really sick. He can't get out of bed sick. And the pirates are going to attack the city. And God, there are so many good Caranzza versus the pirate stories. But I'm going to tell you this one. So the doctor says, look, if you get out of this bed, I think you're going to die. And Caranzza says, I would rather die between the bullets on that beach than between the sheets of this bed.
Oh, yeah.
So
Nice.
He has his sons get him up. And he's so weak he can't ride. They put him on a donkey. And he's so weak he can't ride the donkey. So they tie him down. And then he has his son lead him back and forth across the beach. And he's screaming orders to people that don't exist. And the pirates are watching this, and they're freaked. They think that he's got troops.
Like a hidden army somewhere.
Exactly. He basically just waves them off.
Oh my
like
God.
on the beach.
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, the guy's a stone cold. He's a beast.
Yeah.
The other
All right.
story about him and the pirates.
It's awesome.
Let's save it. If you want to do another one, I'll tell you.
So does Caranzza ever make his time to the fair shores of Italy?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
He was all over Spain, southern Spain, and then he's off to Honduras.
Got it. All right. Cool. All right.
Do you want to roll through with that last one there, Steve?
Yeah, I'll grab the last one. All right. I've got the $1 million question for you here, Puck.
Okay.
All right. It's the early 16th century, the 1500s, and you have been called to serve in a tercio. Would you take duty as a piker, a rodolero, or an arquebusier, or would you try to get into the cavalry, and why?
Oh, man. I think I'd probably have to go with the cavalry for a few reasons. I know, like, cavalry versus pikes is probably not the best choice, but when I used to fence in battles in the SCA, I was too short to stay in the line. So I had to run around and make trouble. And like I was fast enough on my feet that I could get in. One time I got into the back ranks and took out the enemy commander.
Uh-huh.
And then I started yelling orders to the enemy troops, and they were just doing whatever I would say. And I couldn't hit him in the back because that was against the rules.
Right.
So I'd tap one of them on the shoulder like, I need you to step out of the line right now. And then my friends would just boom, and they all did. And then I'd pull out another one.
That's so messed up.
And Caranzza was a captain of the cavalry, and down on the ground, there's so much guns and smoke, you're not going to be able to see. At least when you're in the cavalry, you can kind of see what's going on. Maybe get behind enemy lines and cause trouble.
Yeah, most people seem to go for those horsies. I guess you can always ride away if the battle's going south.
That's my backup plan.
All right. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that's all the questions we got for you, Puck. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, dude.
It was super great talking with you. I hope you guys have a great night, and I appreciate you giving me some time to talk about the tradition.
Yeah, we'll probably tap you back when we go on our Caranzza run.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And the fact that I am so intrigued by Caranzza now is due to your passion. That was awesome. Thank you.
That guy's life is amazing. There's a lot to get into there.
Yeah, that was awesome.
All right, great. Thanks, Puck.
Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of Le Arte dell'Armi, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Puck Curtis again for coming on and sharing his wisdom with us. Next week's episode is going to feature Jen Yandels and Devin Borman talking about cavalry. All that you can imagine about cavalry, using lances, using polearms against people that are on horseback. Whatever you can imagine. Should be a fun episode. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.